Boris the dog decided he had had enough of home life and wanted to see the big city. Ever since he was a puppy, he had dreamed of visiting the big city. He realized the Johnsons wouldn't let him leave the house, so he came up with a clever plan. When little Bobby Johnson came home from school, Boris ran to the front yard and greeted him as he always did. He jumped on little Bobby and licked his face as he did every day. He chewed and tugged on Bobby's shirt as he always had. He clawed Bobby's throat and chewed off little Bobby's face. This was not at all like Boris. Before long, Boris had totally devoured little Bobby and buried his bones in the yard. Mrs. Johnson began to get quite concerned that little Bobby had not arrived home. She thought she might go out and check on him. As she approached the steps, Boris darted between her legs. Mrs. Johnson lost her balance and fell down all 20 stairs. Had she survived the fall, she would have been very annoyed with the puddle of blood on the floor, seeing as she prided herself on keeping her house so clean. Satisfied, Boris went next door and defecated all over the neighbor's stoop. When Mr. Johnson returned home from work, his neighbor Bill Wagner was waiting for him.
Oh, hi, Bill.
How many times have I told you to keep your stupid mud off my property?
I don't know, 5?
Wrong. I guess I'm gonna have to kill you.
Mr. Wagner pulled out a shotgun and fired it at Mr. Johnson. Then Mr. Wagner pumped a few more rounds into Mr. Johnson, even though his first shot hit its mark. Mr. Wagner smiled. He liked the way Mr. Johnson's body twitched at every fresh impact, as though there was still some life left. He couldn't help but be mesmerized at the speckled patterns Mr. Johnson's blood made as it sprinkled across the white shingles and smeared down the front door. He fired a few more shots, until a curious thing happened. He could no longer recognize the object he had been firing at. Clearly it had been human, but no one would be able to say for certain that it was indeed Mr. Johnson. Maybe it was Mrs. Johnson. He fired a few more shots. Maybe it was Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. He fired again. Maybe it was the nebula outside the M5 galaxy near the Andromeda system. Although this hardly seemed plausible. He fired a few more shots, then paused. This notion of subjective reality was reinforced by the seeming arbitrariness of the object of his violence. Certainly, it would be a paradox of the time-space continuum, but who was to say that he wasn't actually firing into the Crab Nebula? Or even more confounding, hadn't he just forged his own nebula? And perhaps a new galaxy. Hadn't he become elevated to the stature of a deity and usurped all the power and wisdom in the universe?
There's no way Mrs. Wagner's gonna serve me tuna casserole tonight.
Suddenly, the marvelous textures and intensity of the red in Mr. Johnson's blood-drenched suit caused Mr. Wagner to catch a glimpse of the true value of art. He hurried home, where he searched for a canvas and began to paint French landscapes at sunset. Before hanging himself. Boris waited for nightfall and was off. When he arrived, he was absolutely amazed at the size of the buildings, the amount of noise, and the number of people in the big city. Well, it wasn't long before one of those many people spotted Boris. She called the police, who picked up Boris and threw him in the dog pound, where he was put to sleep 24 hours later. The end.